They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but what happens when the old dog taught the world how to bark in the first place? My name is Mildred Cooper, though everyone calls me Millie, and at 73 years old, I've been carrying a secret that would shock my entire family. For decades, I've watched my children and grandchildren pat me on the head like some relic from a bygone era, explaining smartphones to me as if I've never seen a computer before. They assume that because my hair is silver and my hands are weathered, my mind must be equally outdated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what they don't know. While they were learning to text, I was learning to code. While they were discovering the internet, I was helping to build it. And while they assume I keep my money in mason jars under the mattress, I've been quietly accumulating a fortune in the very technology they think I don't understand. This is the story of how I went from being dismissed as a confused grandmother to revealing a truth that changed everything my family thought they knew about me. The moment that sparked this revelation happened on a Tuesday evening in March, over what should have been a simple family dinner. But sometimes the smallest moments carry the weight of a lifetime's worth of hidden truths. Sometimes a daughter's careless words can unlock secrets that have been buried for 30 years. And sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet ones have the loudest stories to tell. The aroma of pot roast filled my dining room that Tuesday evening, the same recipe I'd been perfecting for 47 years of marriage. The mahogany table that Robert and I had bought for our first anniversary gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, set for 6 with my grandmother's china. I always used the good dishes when Sarah came to visit. At 45, my eldest daughter carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd climbed the corporate ladder at a prestigious marketing firm, and I wanted everything to be perfect for her. Sarah arrived exactly at 6:30, as punctual as always, her heels clicking, against my hardwood floors with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Her auburn hair was pulled back in what she called a power bun, and her navy blazer screamed success. Behind her trailed my son-in-law David, scrolling through his phone with the dedication of a scholar reading ancient texts, and my 2 grandchildren, Emma and Jake, 16 and 14 respectively, both absorbed in their own glowing screens. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said, giving me the obligatory kiss on the cheek while simultaneously checking her Apple Watch. "Sorry we're running a few minutes behind. The traffic from downtown was absolutely insane, and my phone's GPS took us through some ridiculous route that definitely wasn't optimal." I smiled and smoothed my apron, the same floral pattern I'd worn for Sunday dinners since the children were small. "No trouble at all, sweetheart. I kept everything warm for you." As we settled around the table, I watched my family navigate their devices with an ease that seemed almost choreographed. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with what she explained were urgent client communications, while David split his attention between his tablet and his dinner plate. Emma and Jake had reluctantly placed their phones face down beside their napkins, but their eyes kept drifting toward the dark screens like moths to a flame. "Grandma Millie," Emma said, cutting into her pot roast, "Mom told us you finally got one of those smart TV things. Have you figured out how to use Netflix yet?" I felt that familiar pang in my chest, the one that came whenever my family spoke to me in that particular tone, patient but condescending, as if they were speaking to a child who just learned to tie her shoes. "I'm managing just fine, dear. Mrs. Henderson from next door showed me a few things." Sarah laughed, not unkindly, but with that edge that adult children sometimes develop when discussing their aging parents. "Oh, Mom, you're so sweet. Remember, when you called me in a panic because you couldn't figure out how to answer a FaceTime call, you were pressing the red button instead of the green one for 20 minutes. David chuckled without looking up from his tablet. "At least she's trying. My father still refuses to even touch a smartphone, says he doesn't trust anything that knows more than he does." "It's just different for their generation," Sarah continued, cutting her meat with precise movements. They didn't grow up with this stuff like we did. I mean, Mom probably remembers when televisions were the size of refrigerators and had what, 3 channels? I set down my fork carefully, feeling the weight of decades pressing against my ribs. 4 channels, actually, and they weren't that large. See what I mean? Sarah gestured toward me with her knife, speaking to her children as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. It's like trying to explain quantum physics to someone who learned arithmetic with an abacus. The conceptual gap is just too wide. Jake, my younger grandson, looked up from his barely touched dinner. Grandma, have you ever even used a computer? Like, actually sat down and typed on one? The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. I could feel my heart beating in my throat as 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me, waiting for what they assumed would be an amusing confession of technological incompetence. How could I tell them that I'd been typing on computers since before they were born? That I'd written my first program on punch cards when their mother was still learning to write her name in crayon? A few times, I said quietly, reaching for my water glass to buy myself a moment. Here and there. Sarah's expression softened into what she probably thought was encouragement. Mom, there's no shame in not understanding all this technology stuff. I know it seems overwhelming, but computers and phones and all that, it's just not intuitive for people your age. Your brain works differently than ours do. You guys are analog, and we're digital. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, Sarah would never intentionally hurt me, but because they revealed just how thoroughly invisible I'd become to my own family. Analog. As if I were some kind of outdated machinery, incapable of adapting to the modern world. The important thing, David added, finally looking up from his screen, is that you don't let it frustrate you. My grandmother used to get so worked up about her VCR that she'd call us crying. Technology anxiety is totally normal for seniors. Emma nodded sagely, as if she were dispensing wisdom earned through decades of experience rather than 16 years of being handed increasingly sophisticated devices by parents who wanted to keep her occupied. You just have to remember, Grandma, that it's not your fault. Your generation just wasn't designed for this stuff. Designed. As if we were products manufactured for a specific purpose, with built-in obsolescence dates that had long since expired. I excused myself to fetch dessert from the kitchen, needing a moment to collect myself before I said something I might regret. Standing at my marble countertop, staring at the apple pie I'd baked from scratch that morning, I felt the familiar ache of being misunderstood. But tonight, the feeling was accompanied by something else. A growing sense of indignation that surprised me with its intensity. I'd spent my entire adult life being underestimated. In the 1970s, it was because I was a woman in a male-dominated field. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was because I was a working mother who supposedly couldn't be fully committed to either role. And now, in my 70s, it was because I was old, automatically assumed to be confused and overwhelmed by the very world I'd helped create. When I returned to the dining room with the pie and a pot of fresh coffee, Sarah was in the middle of what sounded like a prepared speech. Her voice had taken on that earnest quality she used when delivering presentations to clients, confident and slightly patronizing. I've been thinking, Mom, and David and I have decided we want to help you get more comfortable with modern technology. We could set up some kind of system where maybe Emma comes over once a week to show you basic computer skills. Nothing too complicated, just email, maybe some simple web browsing, baby steps. She paused to smile at me, clearly pleased with her own generosity. And I think it might be time to start talking about your finances, too. I know Dad handled all that when he was alive, and you've been doing your best. But investment strategies have become so complex. It's all digital now. Online trading platforms, cryptocurrency, algorithmic investments. It's honestly overwhelming even for people who work in finance. My hand trembled slightly as I set down the coffee pot, Robert had been gone for 3 years now, and Sarah had been making increasingly frequent references to my supposed financial helplessness. She meant well, I knew she did, but each suggestion felt like another small erosion of my independence. I actually think, Sarah continued, warming to her topic, that it might make sense for you to move some of your savings into something more modern. I've been doing really well with cryptocurrency lately. Bitcoin, Ethereum, some of the newer altcoins. The returns are incredible, Mom. I mean, traditional investments like savings accounts and CDs are basically worthless now. The interest rates are a joke. David nodded enthusiastically. Sarah's right. The financial world has completely changed. Everything's blockchain-based now. Decentralized finance, smart contracts. It's like trying to navigate with a paper map when everyone else has GPS. The thing is, Sarah said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone about to impart crucial wisdom, people your age just weren't educated about these kinds of opportunities. And that's okay. But it means you need guidance from people who understand how modern markets work. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. What exactly are you suggesting, Sarah? Well, I was thinking, and please don't take this the wrong way, but what if we set up a meeting with my financial advisor? Someone who could look at your portfolio and make some recommendations. I mean, whatever Dad left you, it's probably just sitting in some low-yield savings account or maybe some government bonds that are barely keeping up with inflation. The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had marked time through 4 decades of family dinners, celebrations, and quiet moments. Emma and Jake had returned to their phones, bored by adult conversation about money and technology. But Sarah and David were watching me with expressions of patient expectation, waiting for me to gratefully accept their offer to rescue me from my own financial ignorance. I appreciate the thought, I said carefully, but I'm managing just fine. Sarah's smile became slightly strained. Mom, I'm sure you think you are, but managing money today isn't the same as it was when Dad was alive. The whole system has evolved. There are tax implications, market strategies, digital asset management. It's incredibly complex. And with respect, you've never really had to deal with investments yourself. Never had to deal with investments. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked at my daughter's earnest face, so certain of her own expertise, so convinced of my limitations. How could I explain to her that while she was learning to balance a checkbook in high school, I was already building the foundation of what would become a 7-figure portfolio? How could I tell her that the simple savings account she imagined contained enough money to buy her house 3 times over? Sarah, I said quietly, I think you might be surprised by how much I actually understand about modern finance. She reached across the table and patted my hand, the gesture simultaneously affectionate and dismissive. Oh, Mom, I know you think you do, and I'm sure you've picked up bits and pieces over the years. But trust me, this stuff is my job. I work with hedge fund managers and investment firms every day. The level of sophistication required to navigate today's markets is just. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's graduate-level complexity. Plus, David added, there's the technology component. Everything's done through apps and online platforms now. Real-time trading, algorithm-based portfolio management, automated rebalancing. It's not something you can learn from a book or figure out by trial and error. I felt the last thread of my patience beginning to fray. For 30 years, I'd listened to variations of this same conversation. 30 years of being told I didn't understand, couldn't comprehend, wasn't capable of grasping concepts that I'd been working with since before my children were born. 30 years of nodding and smiling while my own family relegated me to the role of confused elderly woman who needed to be managed and protected from her own limitations. You know what? Sarah said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just had what she considered a brilliant idea. Instead of trying to explain all this to you, why don't I just show you my portfolio? I think seeing actual numbers might help you understand what I mean about modern investment strategies. She pulled out her phone with the flourish of a magician, revealing their greatest trick. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency as she navigated to what I assumed was her trading app. Okay, so this is just my cryptocurrency holdings, she said, turning the phone toward me with obvious pride. I started with about $50,000 6 months ago, and as you can see, I'm up to almost $87,000. That's a 74% return in half a year, Mom. Can you imagine? Your savings account probably earns what, maybe 1% annually? I studied the screen, noting the various digital currencies listed with their current values. Impressive numbers, certainly, though I couldn't help but notice the wild volatility patterns in the charts. The peaks and valleys suggested the kind of extreme market fluctuations that made me nervous, even with my decades of investment experience. That's very impressive, Sarah, I said, meaning it. Any gain was worth celebrating, even if the strategy seemed riskier than I would have chosen. And this is just the beginning, she continued, swiping to another screen. I'm planning to put another 100,000 into DeFi protocols next month. Decentralized finance is absolutely exploding right now. We're talking about potential returns of 2, 3, even 400%. David leaned over to peer at the phone. That's incredible, honey. You're like a cryptocurrency genius. Sarah beamed at the praise, then looked at me with an expression of gentle pity. This is what I mean, Mom. This is the kind of opportunity you're missing by keeping your money in traditional investments. The world has moved beyond stocks and bonds. Those are 20th century strategies for a 21st century market. I nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. I understood the intoxicating appeal of quick gains and revolutionary technologies. I understood the confidence that came with early success in volatile markets. And I understood the dangerous assumption that recent performance guaranteed future results. I can see why you're excited, I said diplomatically. Excited is an understatement, Sarah laughed. I'm actually thinking about liquidating some of my traditional investments to put more money into crypto. I mean, why would I keep money in something earning 5% when I could be earning 500%? The question hung in the air, rhetorical but revealing. I could see the gleam in my daughter's eyes. The same look I'd seen in countless investors over the years who'd discovered what they believed was a foolproof system for beating the market. It was the look of someone who'd confused a bull market with personal genius who'd mistaken timing for talent. What does your financial advisor think about that strategy? I asked. Sarah waved a dismissive hand. Financial advisors are all stuck in the old paradigm. They don't understand disruption. They're still recommending mutual funds and index funds. Like it's 1985. The whole industry is going to be obsolete in 5 years. Mom, Emma said suddenly, looking up from her phone. Didn't you say you wanted to learn about investing? Maybe Mom could teach you about cryptocurrency. It's actually pretty easy once you understand blockchain technology. The suggestion was offered with the casual condescension of a teenager who assumed her grandmother's brain was incapable of processing any concept more complex than turning on a television. But it was Sarah's response that truly stung. Oh, sweetheart, that's sweet of you to suggest, but I think cryptocurrency might be a little too advanced for Grandma. Remember, she's still learning how to use email properly. We need to start with much more basic concepts. Too advanced. The words settled in my chest like stones, heavy and cold. I thought about the countless hours I'd spent researching blockchain technology when Bitcoin was still trading for pennies. I thought about the white papers I'd read, the technical forums I'd participated in, the careful analysis I'd done before making my first cryptocurrency investment in 2011. I thought about the portfolio they assumed didn't exist, growing steadily year after year while they debated whether I was capable of understanding the very markets I'd been navigating for decades. You're probably right, I said quietly, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Sarah's expression softened with what she clearly believed was compassion. Mom, please don't feel bad about this. Nobody expects you to understand cryptocurrency or modern investing. It's just not realistic for someone your age. The learning curve is too steep, and honestly, the technology changes so fast that even people who work in the field struggle to keep up. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The important thing is that you recognize your limitations and let people who understand these things help you. There's no shame in admitting, "You're out of your depth." Out of my depth. The phrase echoed in my mind as I watched my family finish their dessert, their conversation moving on to other topics: Emma's college applications, Jake's basketball season, David's upcoming business trip. They chatted easily about their lives, their plans, their sophisticated understanding of a world they assumed had left me behind. I sat quietly, playing the role of the pleasant grandmother who listened more than she spoke, who smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals, who asked simple questions that didn't require complex answers. It was a role I'd perfected over the years, a comfortable mask that allowed me to observe without being observed, to understand without being understood. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the mask felt heavier than usual, more constraining. Maybe it was Sarah's casual dismissal of my capabilities, or Emma's assumption that I needed to be taught the basics of a field I'd been working in longer than she'd been alive. Maybe it was the accumulation of 3 decades of being underestimated, of watching my family construct an elaborate fiction about my limitations while I nodded along like a benign decoration. As Sarah gathered her purse and started to herd her family toward the door, she paused in the hallway and turned back to me with that particular expression she wore when she was about to dispense advice. "Mom, I want you to think about what I said tonight. About the financial advisor, I mean. I know change is scary, especially at your age, but you can't just ignore the evolution of the financial world. The longer you wait, the further behind you'll fall." She kissed my cheek, her perfume an expensive cloud that would linger in my hallway long after she'd gone. "I'll call you this weekend, and we can set up that appointment. It'll be good for you to have someone explain modern investment strategies in terms you can understand." I watched from my doorway as they piled into Sarah's luxury SUV, a vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter lecturing me about financial sophistication from behind the wheel of a car I could have purchased with loose change from my investment accounts. After their taillights disappeared into the darkness, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling suddenly exhausted. The house seemed impossibly quiet after the evening's conversation, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and accumulated silence. I walked slowly to my home office, a small room at the back of the house that Robert had helped me set up years ago. It was my sanctuary, lined with books on economics and technology, furnished with a desk that had seen decades of careful work. In the corner sat what Sarah would have dismissively called an old computer, a machine that was actually more powerful than the supercomputers I'd worked with in my early career. I settled into my chair and powered up the system, waiting for the familiar glow of the monitor to illuminate the room. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who'd been typing before personal computers existed, who'd learned to navigate digital systems when they were still exotic curiosities rather than daily necessities. The login screen appeared and I entered my credentials, passwords that would have impressed Sarah with their complexity if she'd known they existed. The desktop loaded, revealing an array of applications and files that represented decades of careful research, analysis, and investment decisions. I opened my primary trading platform, the same one that Sarah had shown me on her phone, though my account contained significantly more zeros than hers. The familiar interface welcomed me back, displaying real-time market data, portfolio performance metrics, and a wealth of information that would have taken Sarah years to fully understand. My cryptocurrency holdings alone were worth more than Sarah's entire portfolio, and they represented less than 5% of my total investments. The numbers on the screen told a story of patience, research, and calculated risk-taking that spanned 3 decades. They told the story of a woman who'd been building wealth in technological innovation since before the internet existed, who'd recognized the potential of digital currencies when they were still considered a curiosity for computer enthusiasts. But more than that, they told the story of someone who'd learned to hide her successes, to downplay her understanding, to accept being underestimated because it was easier than constantly defending her competence. They told the story of a woman who'd become invisible in plain sight, whose family had constructed such a thorough narrative of her limitations that they couldn't see the evidence of her capabilities even when it was sitting right in front of them. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, feeling the full weight of 30 years of silence pressing against my chest. Tomorrow, Sarah would call to schedule that appointment with her financial advisor. She would speak to me in that patient, condescending tone she'd perfected, explaining concepts I'd understood since before she was born. She would offer to manage my money, to save me from my own financial ignorance, never suspecting that my portfolio could fund her lifestyle for the rest of her life without making a meaningful dent in my net worth. The question that haunted me wasn't whether I should reveal the truth, it was whether my family would believe it even if I did. After decades of treating me like a confused elderly woman who needed protection from her own limitations, would they be able to accept that I'd been playing a completely different game all along? I closed the trading platform and shut down the computer, but I remained sitting in the darkness of my office, thinking about masks and truth, about the price of being underestimated and the cost of correcting that misunderstanding. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its quiet rhythm of evening routines and bedtime preparations, while inside, I contemplated a secret that had grown heavier with each passing year. For the first time in 3 decades, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being invisible. What would happen if the quiet grandmother they thought they knew turned out to be someone else entirely? What would happen if I revealed that while they were learning to navigate the digital world, I had been one of the people building it? The questions followed me as I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs to bed, where I would lie awake thinking about cryptocurrency and condescension, about daughters who couldn't see their mothers clearly, and about the strange burden of carrying secrets that nobody would believe even if you told them. Tomorrow would bring another day of being Mildred Cooper, the sweet grandmother who didn't understand technology and needed help managing her simple finances. But tonight, for just a few minutes, I had allowed myself to remember who I really was beneath the mask I'd worn for so long that even I sometimes forgot it wasn't my real face. The truth was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. The question was whether my family would be ready for it either. Sleep eluded me that night, as it often did when memories of the past collided with the realities of the present. I lay beneath the quilt that my mother had sewn for my wedding trousseau, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed midnight, then 1 o'clock, then 2, marking the passage of hours that stretched like elastic between what was and what had been. Finally, I gave up the pretense of rest and padded downstairs in my robe and slippers, drawn once again to my office and the secrets it contained. But instead of turning on the computer, I pulled open the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one that Sarah had never thought to examine during her periodic visits to help organize my affairs. Beneath folders of tax returns and insurance policies lay a leather portfolio that had remained untouched for years, its surface worn smooth by handling and time. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, awards, and documents that told a story my family had never heard. The first photograph showed a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a conservative dress and standing beside what looked like a room-sized machine covered in blinking lights and spinning tape reels. The woman was me, 26 years old and fresh out of graduate school, on my first day at Integrated Systems Corporation in Mountain View, California. The year was 1972, and I was one of only 3 women in a department of 47 programmers and engineers. The machine behind me in the photograph was an IBM System 370, a marvel of modern computing that filled an entire climate-controlled room and possessed less processing power than the smartphone Sarah carried in her purse. But to me, standing there in my carefully pressed dress and sensible shoes, it represented the future itself. I traced the edge of the photograph with my finger, remembering the mixture of excitement and terror I'd felt that first morning. I'd spent 4 years earning my degree in mathematics with a specialization in what was then called electronic data processing, a field so new that most universities were still figuring out how to teach it. My professors had been brilliant, but scattered, working from textbooks that were obsolete before the ink was dry, trying to prepare students for careers that didn't yet fully exist. The transition from abstract theory to practical application had been jarring. In college, we'd worked with punch cards and batch processing systems, submitting our programs to the computer operators and waiting hours or sometimes days for results. But at Integrated Systems, I found myself working with interactive terminals, real-time processing, and problems that required solutions no textbook had ever addressed. My supervisor, Dr. Harrison Webb, had been skeptical about hiring women for technical positions. He'd made his feelings clear during my interview, asking pointed questions about my plans for marriage and children, wondering aloud whether I possessed the logical thinking necessary for complex programming tasks. But Integrated Systems had government contracts that required them to demonstrate equal opportunity hiring practices, and my academic credentials were impeccable. They needed someone with my qualifications, even if they weren't entirely convinced that someone like me could handle the work. I'd proven them wrong within 6 months. The second photograph in the portfolio showed me standing with a team of 5 other programmers beside a wall-mounted display showing lines of code. We'd just completed the development of what would become one of the first real-time inventory management systems for retail chains, a project that had consumed 14 months of 16-hour days and countless nights spent debugging code that seemed to take on a malevolent life of its own. The system we'd built was revolutionary for its time. Instead of the batch processing that most businesses relied on, our software could track inventory levels, sales patterns, and supply chain logistics in real time, updating automatically as transactions occurred across multiple locations. It was the kind of integrated data management that companies like Walmart would later use to dominate their industries, but in 1973, it was considered almost impossibly sophisticated. The success of that project had earned me recognition within the company and, more importantly, the respect of colleagues who had initially viewed me as a diversity hire rather than a serious technologist. Dr. Webb, who had questioned my hiring, became one of my strongest advocates, recommending me for increasingly complex assignments and eventually for promotion to senior systems analyst. But it was the third photograph that held the most significance. Though someone without knowledge of computer history might have dismissed it as unremarkable, it showed a small group of people gathered around a conference table, papers and coffee cups scattered across its surface, everyone looking tired but satisfied. The date written on the back was December 15, 1975, and the location was listed as Conference Room B, ISC Headquarters. What the photograph didn't show was that we'd just completed the final specifications for what would become the architecture underlying the first commercially viable personal computer operating system. While companies like IBM and Digital Equipment Corporation were focused on mainframe and mini-computer systems for large organizations, our small team had been working on something different, software that could manage the resources of much smaller machines intended for individual users. The project had been considered a curiosity by most of our colleagues, who couldn't imagine why anyone would want a computer in their home or small office. Computers were serious tools for serious work, they argued, requiring specially trained operators and carefully controlled environments. The idea that ordinary people might someday use computers for personal tasks seemed as fantastical as owning a personal jet airplane or having a private telephone switchboard. But a few of us had a different vision. We could see that the trend toward miniaturization that was revolutionizing electronics would eventually make powerful computers small and cheap enough for widespread adoption. When that happened, there would be a massive need for software that could make these machines accessible to people without technical training. The operating system we designed was elegant in its simplicity, hiding the complex interactions between hardware and software behind an interface that felt intuitive even to first-time users. We built in features that wouldn't become standard in commercial systems for another decade: hierarchical file systems, memory management routines that prevented one program from crashing others, and a command structure that used plain English words instead of cryptic abbreviations. Our work caught the attention of several Silicon Valley startups that were beginning to experiment with personal computers. In 1976, a small company that had been founded in a garage offered to license our operating system for use in their new machine. The licensing fee was modest, just $50,000 plus a small royalty on each unit sold. Most of my colleagues thought the deal was a waste of time, but I saw something they didn't. The founders of that garage startup had the same vision we did, and they had the entrepreneurial drive to turn vision into reality. The company was Apple Computer, and the machine was what would become the Apple II. I turned the page in my portfolio and found a yellowed newspaper clipping from the San Jose Mercury News, dated December 12, 1980. The headline read, "Local Tech. Worker strikes gold in Apple stock windfall," and the article featured a photograph of me standing outside the modest ranch house that Robert and I had purchased in Sunnyvale. The reporter had done a brief feature on early Apple employees and contractors whose stock options and royalty agreements had made them wealthy as the company went public. At the time of the article, my royalty payments from Apple were generating more annual income than my regular salary at Integrated Systems. But that was just the beginning. The real wealth came from understanding what was happening in the broader technology industry and having the foresight to invest in companies that were positioned to benefit from the personal computer revolution. While my colleagues were debating whether personal computers were a fad or a genuine trend, I was quietly purchasing stock in semiconductor companies, software developers, and manufacturers of computer components. I bought shares in Intel when they were trading for $12, convinced that the demand for microprocessors would explode as computers became smaller and more powerful. I invested in Microsoft when most people had never heard of them, recognizing that software would eventually become more valuable than hardware. The strategy required patience and conviction that sometimes wavered in the face of market volatility, and skeptical advice from financial professionals. During the tech recession of 1981-1982, my portfolio lost nearly 40% of its value in 18 months. Robert, who had been supportive but nervous about my aggressive investing strategy, suggested that we sell our technology holdings and move the money into more conservative investments. But I held on, convinced that the fundamental trends driving the computer industry were just beginning to unfold. I continued to work at Integrated Systems, continued to develop software and analyze technological trends, and continued to invest my earnings in companies that I believed would shape the future of computing. By 1985, when we moved back to Chicago so Robert could take over his father's accounting practice, my technology investments were worth more than $1 million. It was an enormous sum for someone my age, especially for a woman who had started her career earning $7,000 annually. But more importantly, it represented validation of my belief that I understood the technology industry better than most people gave me credit for. The transition from Silicon Valley back to the Midwest had been difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. In California, I'd been surrounded by people who shared my fascination with technological innovation, who understood the significance of the work we were doing, who saw the computer revolution as something exciting rather than threatening. But In Chicago, I found myself once again in the position of being an anomaly. A woman with technical expertise in a field that most people found mysterious and intimidating. Robert's family and social circle were warm and welcoming, but they had no context for understanding my background or my continued interest in technology investing. When I tried to explain why I was purchasing stock in companies they'd never heard of, their eyes would glaze over with polite incomprehension. When I attempted to discuss the implications of new developments in computing, the conversation would quickly shift to more familiar topics. Gradually, I learned to keep my professional history and my investment activities to myself. It was easier to let people assume I was simply a housewife who had worked briefly in some vague clerical capacity before marriage and motherhood. The fiction protected them from having to grapple with concepts they found uncomfortable, and it protected me from having to constantly defend my expertise or justify my decisions. When Sarah was born in 1978, I threw myself into motherhood with the same intensity I'd once brought to software development. I read every book on child psychology and early learning, consulted with pediatricians and educational specialists, and created elaborate systems for tracking developmental milestones and enrichment activities. Robert used to joke that I approached parenting like a research project, complete with hypotheses, data collection, and analysis of results. But even during those busy years of raising children, I maintained my connections to the technology industry and continued to invest in companies that I believed were positioned for growth. I subscribed to trade publications, attended the occasional industry conference, and maintained correspondence with former colleagues who kept me informed about emerging trends and opportunities. The birth of the internet in the early 1990s felt like vindication of everything I'd believed about the future of computing. I'd been predicting since the 1970s that computers would eventually be connected in vast networks that would enable new forms of communication and information sharing. When the World Wide Web began to gain mainstream adoption, I recognized it as the fulfillment of that prediction and immediately began investing in companies that were building the infrastructure and applications that would support online commerce and communication. By the time Sarah graduated from college in 2000, my portfolio was worth more than $10 million. The dot-com crash that devastated so many investors barely touched my holdings because I'd focused on companies with solid business models and sustainable competitive advantages rather than speculative startups with no revenue. While day traders and momentum investors saw their portfolios evaporate, my carefully selected technology stocks continued to generate steady returns. But success brought its own challenges. The larger my portfolio grew, the more difficult it became to discuss my investments with family and friends who assumed I had modest savings and a basic understanding of financial matters. How could I explain that I owned significant positions in Google and Amazon before they became household names? How could I discuss the implications of mobile computing and cloud infrastructure with people who still found email confusing? The solution was to become increasingly private about my financial affairs. I maintained separate investment accounts that Robert knew about but didn't actively monitor, explained my stock purchases as small investments based on hunches about companies I'd read about in the newspaper. When technology stocks began generating substantial dividend income, I attributed my improved financial position to lucky picks and conservative money management. The strategy worked so well that even Robert, who reviewed our tax returns every year, never fully grasped the extent of my technology holdings. He saw the individual transactions and the summary statements, but he didn't piece together the broader picture of what I'd been building over the course of 2 decades. To him, I was his intelligent wife who had a knack for picking winning stocks, not a sophisticated investor who had been accumulating wealth in technological innovation since before most people owned calculators. After Robert's death in 2021, maintaining the fiction became both easier and more difficult. Easier because I no longer had to explain my investment decisions to anyone, but more difficult because Sarah began taking an increasingly active interest in what she assumed were my simple financial affairs. She offered to help me organize my investments, suggested that I might benefit from professional financial advice, and gradually began treating me like someone who needed protection from her own fiscal incompetence. The irony was bitter and complete. My daughter, who worked in marketing and had discovered cryptocurrency investing 6 months earlier, was offering to teach me about modern financial markets. My grandchildren, who had never lived in a world without computers, assumed I was baffled by technology that I'd been using since before they were born. My family had constructed such a thorough narrative of my limitations that they couldn't see the evidence of my capabilities, even when it was documented in decades of financial records. I closed the portfolio and returned it to its hiding place, in the filing cabinet, feeling the weight of accumulated secrets pressing against my chest. Tomorrow, Sarah would call to schedule that appointment with her financial advisor, confident that she was rescuing me from my own ignorance. She would speak to me in that patient, condescending tone she'd perfected, explaining concepts I'd understood since she was in diapers. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet darkness of my office, I allowed myself to remember who I'd been before I became invisible. I remembered the young woman who had stood beside room-sized computers and imagined a world where everyone would carry more computing power in their pocket than NASA had used to reach the moon. I remembered the programmer who had written code that still ran on millions of machines around the world, the analyst who had recognized the potential of companies that would eventually reshape entire industries. I remembered the investor who had turned a modest salary into a fortune by understanding technology trends years before they became obvious to mainstream observers. I remembered the woman who had helped build the digital foundation of the modern world, then watched her own family dismiss her as too old and confused to understand the tools she'd helped create. The memories were both painful and empowering, reminders of capabilities that I'd hidden so successfully that even I sometimes forgot they existed. But they were also reminders of a choice I'd made long ago, to prioritize my family's comfort over my own recognition, to accept being underestimated rather than constantly defending my competence. For 30 years, that choice had seemed reasonable, even noble. But sitting in the darkness of my home office, surrounded by the physical evidence of a career and investment strategy that my family couldn't imagine, I began to wonder whether the time had come to stop being invisible. The question that had haunted me since dinner began to take on greater urgency. What would happen if I revealed the truth? What would happen if the quiet grandmother they thought they knew turned out to be someone else entirely? What would happen if I stopped pretending to be confused by the very world I'd helped create? Outside, the neighborhood settled deeper into its nighttime quiet, while inside, I contemplated the strange burden of carrying secrets that had grown heavier with each passing year. The truth was more than just a number in a bank account or a collection of stock certificates. The truth was a lifetime of expertise dismissed, contributions ignored, and capabilities denied. But the truth was also power, and power carried its own responsibilities. If I chose to reveal what I'd been hiding, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that had protected my family from having to reconsider their assumptions about me. There would be questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer, conversations I wasn't certain I wanted to have. As I made my way back upstairs to bed, I carried with me the weight of decision postponed but not avoided. Tomorrow would bring another day of being Mildred Cooper, the sweet grandmother who needed help understanding the modern world. But somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, between memory and possibility, I was beginning to imagine what it might feel like to be seen clearly for the first time in decades. The photographs in the portfolio told one story, but the real story was still being written. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't sure how it would end. The call came at 7:23 in the morning, 3 days after our dinner. I was in my garden, deadheading the roses that had bloomed magnificently despite the late spring frost, when Sarah's ringtone pierced the quiet morning air. Her voice carried a tremor I hadn't heard since she was 16 and had wrecked Robert's car on her way to a friend's party. "Mom, I need to come over, right now. Can you put on some coffee?" 20 minutes later, Sarah sat at my kitchen table, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting panic. Her hands shook as she lifted the coffee mug to her lips, and I noticed she'd bitten, her nails down to the quick, a nervous habit she'd abandoned in college. "It's gone, Mom. All of it. The cryptocurrency portfolio I showed you? It crashed overnight. Some kind of market manipulation or regulatory announcement. I don't even understand. What happened, but everything just collapsed." She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and showed me the trading app she'd been so proud of displaying just days earlier. Where there had once been a balance of $87,000, now there was a number so small, it seemed almost mocking. $3,218.47. "Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, feeling the cold tremor that ran through her fingers. "When did this happen?" "Sometime between midnight and 6 this morning. I woke up to 17 notifications. On my phone, all of them alerts about massive price drops. By the time I could log in to try to sell, everything had already bottomed out." Her voice cracked on the last words, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. "The DeFi protocols I was planning to invest in? They all collapsed too. Something about a smart contract vulnerability that wiped out billions of dollars across multiple platforms." I nodded, remembering similar crashes I'd witnessed over the decades. The tulip mania of the digital age, I'd called it in my private notes, watching as fortunes built on speculation and momentum evaporated as quickly as they'd appeared. But knowing that such crashes were inevitable didn't make watching my daughter suffer through one any easier. "How much did you lose total?" I asked gently. $84,000. Everything I'd put into crypto, plus the gains." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara. "But that's not the worst part, Mom. The worst part is that I'd already committed to putting another 100,000 into those DeFi protocols. I was supposed to transfer the money this morning." The magnitude of what she was telling me began to sink in. "Sarah, where was that 100,000 going to come from?" "I liquidated my traditional investment accounts yesterday, sold my mutual funds, cashed out my 401k early, even borrowed against David's life insurance policy. I was so confident, Mom." The returns looked so incredible, and everyone in the crypto community was saying this was just the beginning of a massive bull run. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "So you still have that money? You haven't lost it?" "I have it, but it's sitting in my checking account earning nothing. And I already owe penalties and taxes on the early 401k withdrawal. Plus, David doesn't know about any of this yet. I told him I was just diversifying our portfolio, not that I was liquidating everything we'd built up over 15 years of marriage." She buried her face in her hands, and her shoulders began to shake with suppressed sobs. "I thought I was being so smart, Mom. I thought I understood something that traditional investors didn't. I kept reading about people making millions in cryptocurrency, and I wanted to be one of them. I wanted to prove that I could generate the kind of returns that would set our family up for life." The irony was almost unbearable. Here was my daughter, devastated by the collapse of investments she'd made based on greed and speculation, while sitting across from someone who had actually generated the life-changing returns she'd been chasing. But the returns I'd achieved had come through decades of patient research, careful analysis, and understanding the fundamental value of technological innovation, not through chasing the latest get-rich-quick scheme. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "I don't know. I was hoping maybe you could help me figure out how to put everything back together. You've always been good with practical problems, and I need someone to help me think through my options." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes that reminded me of the little girl who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting that I could somehow make everything better. "I could loan you some money to help cover the penalties." "And taxes," I offered carefully. "It wouldn't be easy for me, but I could probably manage a few $1,000s. Aunt Sarah's expression crumpled further. Mom, you're so sweet to offer, but I need more than a few $1,000s. The penalties and taxes alone are going to be almost $30,000. And that doesn't even address the fact that we've lost 15 years' worth of retirement savings. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling, exhaustion and despair written across her features. I keep thinking about what you said the other night, about understanding more about modern finance than I realized. I was so condescending. To you, Mom. So sure that I knew better, so convinced that you couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated strategies I was using. The opportunity was there, hanging in the air between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or ignore. My daughter was broken and humbled, finally ready to listen rather than lecture. For the first time in years, she was looking at me as someone who might have wisdom to offer, rather than someone who needed to be managed and protected. But crossing that bridge would mean revealing secrets I'd kept for 30 years. It would mean explaining how the confused grandmother she'd been, patronizing, actually understood financial markets better than she did. It would mean admitting that I'd been hiding not just knowledge, but wealth that could solve her problems instantly. Sarah, I said slowly, what if I told you that your assessment of my financial understanding might not be entirely accurate? She managed a weak smile. Mom, I appreciate you trying to make me feel better, but I think we've established that cryptocurrency and modern investing are pretty complex topics. This isn't your fault. It's mine for being arrogant and stupid. That's not what I mean. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where Robert and I had spent so many peaceful mornings discussing everything from politics to our children's futures. What if I told you that the reason I seemed so calm about your investment strategy wasn't because I didn't understand it, but because I've seen similar bubbles and crashes before? What do you mean you've seen them before? I turned back, to face her, feeling the weight of decisions settling on my shoulders. I mean that I've been investing in technology companies for longer than you've been alive. I mean that what you think of as my simple savings account is actually a portfolio that's weathered dozens of market cycles over the past 40 years. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, confusion replacing despair in her expression. Mom, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm saying that your mother isn't quite the financial innocent you believe her to be. I sat back down at the table and looked directly into her eyes. I'm saying that the woman you've been offering to educate about modern investing has been building wealth in technology stocks since before you were born. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Sarah's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, as if her brain was struggling to process information that didn't fit with 3 decades of established assumptions. That's impossible, she finally whispered. You've never mentioned anything about investing in technology companies. You've never talked about having any kind of sophisticated financial knowledge. Because you've never asked. Because every time the subject came up, you immediately assumed I didn't understand and began explaining basic concepts to me as if I were a child. The words came out more sharply than I'd intended, carrying decades of accumulated frustration. Because it was easier to let you believe what you wanted to believe than to constantly defend my competence. But, Mom, if what you're saying is true, why didn't you tell me? When I was showing off my cryptocurrency portfolio and lecturing you about modern investment strategies, why didn't you say something? The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure either of us was ready to explore. How could I explain that I'd watched her make the same mistakes I'd seen countless investors make over the years? How could I tell her that I'd tried to offer gentle warnings that she'd dismissed because they came from someone she viewed as financially naive? Because you weren't ready to hear it, I said finally. Because you were so excited about your success, so confident in your strategy, that any suggestion from me would have been seen as the worried meddling of an elderly woman who didn't understand modern markets. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions as she processed what I was telling her. Confusion gave way to skepticism, which gradually transformed into something that looked like dawning recognition. When you asked me about my financial advisor's opinion on liquidating traditional investments for cryptocurrency, that wasn't just casual interest, was it? You actually knew that it was a risky strategy. Sarah, sweetheart, concentrating your entire portfolio in a single asset class that has no intrinsic value and is subject to extreme volatility has never been a sound investment strategy. That's not modern financial wisdom. That's speculation, based on hope and greed. She winced at the bluntness of my assessment, but she didn't argue. How much do you actually know about investing? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. How could I summarize 4 decades of studying markets, analyzing companies, and building wealth through careful research and patient accumulation? How could I explain that the financial knowledge she assumed I lacked was actually more extensive than her own? Enough to know that sustainable wealth comes from understanding the fundamental value of companies and technologies, not from chasing momentum and speculation. I paused, then decided to take the plunge. Enough to have built a portfolio worth considerably more than the $84,000 you just lost. How much more? The question came out as barely a whisper. I looked at my daughter, sitting across from me in her wrinkled designer blouse and smeared makeup, devastated by losses that represented less than what I typically gained or lost in a single day of normal market fluctuation. The gulf between her perception of my financial position and the reality was so vast that I wasn't sure she'd be able to process the truth. Sarah, what would you say if I told you that your mother's investment portfolio is worth several $1 million? The color drained from her face completely. I would say that's impossible. I would say that there's no way you could have accumulated that kind of money without us knowing about it. And yet, here we are. I stood up again, needing movement to contain the nervous energy coursing through my body. Here we are having a conversation about financial markets where you're discovering that your assumptions about my knowledge and capabilities might have been incorrect. Several $1 million, she repeated, as if saying the words might make them more comprehensible. Mom, that's not possible. Dad was an accountant, for heaven's sake. He would have known if you had millions of dollars in investments. Your father knew I had substantial investments. He reviewed our tax returns every year and saw the dividend income and capital gains. But he trusted me to manage that portion of our finances, and I never felt the need to provide detailed explanations of my investment strategy. But millions of dollars? How is that even possible on the salaries you and Dad earned? This was the moment when I would have to reveal not just the existence of my wealth, but its origins. This was when I would have to explain that the technologically illiterate mother she thought she knew had actually been a pioneer in the computer industry, that the woman she'd been patronizing about digital investments had been building wealth in technology companies since before personal computers existed. Sarah, there are things about my professional background that you don't know. Things about my education and my early career that I never saw the need to discuss because they seemed irrelevant to my role as your mother. What kind of things? I walked to the kitchen counter and pulled out my phone, opening the trading app that Sarah had shown me days earlier. But instead of logging into her account with its devastating losses, I entered my own credentials and waited for the portfolio summary to load. Things like the fact that I have advanced degrees in mathematics and computer science. Things like the fact that I spent the first 15 years of my career working as a software engineer and systems analyst in Silicon Valley. Things like the fact that I've been investing in technology companies since the 1970s because I understood their potential in ways that most people couldn't. The portfolio summary appeared on the screen, displaying numbers that would have seemed impossible to Sarah just moments earlier. I turned the phone toward her, watching her eyes widen as she processed the information. "This is your account?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "This is one of my accounts," I corrected. "The primary one, but not the only one." Sarah stared at the screen for a long time, scrolling through holdings that included positions in every major technology company she could name and many she couldn't. The numbers were staggering not just in their magnitude, but in their implications. This wasn't inherited wealth or lottery winnings. This was wealth built through systematic investment in companies and technologies that I'd understood well enough to bet my financial future on. Apple stock purchased in 1976, she read aloud. Microsoft purchased in 1986. Google purchased in 2004. She looked up at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. Mom, these purchase dates go back decades. Some of these companies weren't even public companies when you bought them. Some of them weren't even founded when I started tracking their development, I said quietly. I've been watching and investing in the technology industry for longer than you've been alive, Sarah. The digital world you take for granted? I was there when it was being built. She set the phone down on the table and stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. I don't understand any of this. How can you have been a software engineer? How can you have millions of dollars in investments? How can everything I thought I knew about you be wrong? The question carried decades of accumulated assumptions, crashing into an impossible new reality. How could the sweet grandmother who needed help with her smart TV actually be a sophisticated investor who had been building wealth in cutting-edge technology? How could the woman who seemed confused by email actually understand financial markets better than investment professionals? It's not that everything you thought you knew was wrong, I said gently. It's that you never asked the right questions. You saw an elderly woman who seemed comfortable with traditional roles and simple explanations, and you assumed that was all there was to see. But why didn't you correct us? Why didn't you tell us about your background, your investments, your expertise? The pain in her voice was evident, and I realized that my revelations weren't just surprising her. They were forcing her to confront the possibility that she'd been unknowingly condescending to someone who deserved far more respect than she'd been given. Because it was easier to let you believe what you wanted to believe. Because challenging your assumptions would have required constantly defending my competence, explaining my decisions, and proving my understanding of topics you thought were beyond my grasp. I sat back down and reached for her hands, which were still trembling. Because being underestimated can sometimes be a gift. People don't feel threatened by someone they perceive as harmless and out of touch. They don't question your motives or compete with your success when they don't believe you're capable of having any. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. We had no idea. I know you didn't, and I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty about the past. I'm telling you because you're sitting here devastated by financial losses that I can fix with a phone call, and because maybe it's time for both of us to stop pretending that I'm someone I'm not. The offer hung in the air between us, unspoken, but understood. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the tears of despair she'd shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, relief, and something that might have been gratitude. You would help me? Even after how I've treated you, how dismissive I've been. Sarah, you're my daughter. Of course I would help you. The question is whether you're ready to accept help from someone whose financial judgment you might need to start trusting instead of questioning. She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the napkin I handed her. I think my perspective on your financial judgment might need some serious adjustment. Good, because the first thing we're going to do is develop a real investment strategy based on understanding value rather than chasing speculation. The second thing we're going to do is make sure you never again risk more money than you can. Afford to lose on investments you don't fully understand. And the third thing? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. The third thing is that we're going to have a very long conversation about why your mother might know more about technology and finance than you've been giving her credit for. For the first time since she'd arrived that morning, Sarah smiled back. I think I'm ready for that conversation now. But even as I felt the relief of finally sharing my secret, I knew that this revelation was just the beginning. Sarah would have questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The rest of the family would need to be told. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered what other assumptions about me might need to be challenged, what other aspects of my carefully constructed invisibility might need to be examined. The mask I'd worn for 3 decades was finally beginning to slip, and I wasn't entirely sure what would be revealed beneath it. The following weeks passed in a blur of difficult conversations and careful reconstructions. Sarah had taken leave from work, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue, and spent most days at my kitchen table with laptops and financial documents spread across every available surface. We worked together to untangle the mess. Her speculation had created, and slowly, methodically, I began to teach her what I'd learned about building sustainable wealth over 4 decades of patient investing. The first lesson was the hardest for her to accept, admitting that everything she thought she knew about modern finance had been built on a foundation of marketing, rather than understanding. The cryptocurrency community she'd been so eager to join wasn't comprised of financial visionaries revolutionizing investment strategy. They were mostly ordinary people caught up in collective delusion, mistaking price momentum for genuine value creation. "I keep reading the forums I used to trust," Sarah said one afternoon, scrolling through her laptop screen with the expression of growing disillusionment. "The same people who were preaching about diamond hands and holding to the moon are now posting about how the crash was caused by institutional manipulation and government interference. Nobody's taking responsibility for promoting strategies that were obviously unsustainable." I looked up from the annual report I was reviewing, a document from a semiconductor company I'd been tracking for potential investment. That's because taking responsibility would require admitting they didn't understand what they were promoting. It's easier to blame external forces than to acknowledge that they were participating in a speculative bubble that was always going to end badly. But the technology is still sound, isn't it? Blockchain, smart contracts, decentralized finance. Those concepts have real value, don't they? The question revealed how much she was still struggling to separate genuine technological innovation from the hype and speculation that had surrounded it. This was another lesson I'd learned over the decades. Truly transformative technologies were often buried beneath layers of exaggeration and misunderstanding that made it difficult to assess their actual potential. "Some of the underlying technology has merit," I said carefully. "But having valuable technology doesn't automatically translate to having valuable investments. The internet was revolutionary technology, but that didn't prevent hundreds of dot-com companies from collapsing when their business models proved unsustainable." I pulled out a folder containing research I'd been compiling on blockchain applications, material I'd been studying for years while my family assumed I was overwhelmed by simple email management. The key is learning to distinguish between companies that are solving real problems with innovative technology and companies that are simply using technology buzzwords to attract investment from people who don't understand the difference. Sarah leaned over to examine the documents I was sharing, her eyes widening as she recognized the depth and sophistication of analysis I'd been conducting. Financial projections, competitive landscape assessments, technical feasibility studies, the kind of research that investment professionals charge thousands of dollars to produce. "Mom, how long have you been doing this level of analysis?" "Since the beginning. Since I realized that successful investing requires understanding not just financial metrics, but the technological and competitive factors that drive those metrics." I pointed to a chart showing the adoption curves of various blockchain applications. "This isn't guesswork or intuition. This is systematic research into how new technologies actually get implemented in real business environments." She studied the charts for several minutes, absorbing information that contradicted much of what she'd been reading in cryptocurrency forums and social media groups. According to this, most of the DeFi protocols I was planning to invest in don't actually solve any problems that existing financial systems can't handle more efficiently. That's correct. They create complexity without adding value, which makes them interesting academic exercises but poor investment opportunities. I pulled out another document, this one analyzing the environmental costs of various cryptocurrency mining operations. And many of them consume enormous amounts of energy to perform computations that serve no productive purpose beyond maintaining artificial scarcity. The revelation seemed to hit her like a physical blow. So I wasn't just unlucky with market timing. I was investing in projects that were fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Sarah, you were investing based on hope and social proof rather than analysis and understanding. That's not a character flaw. It's a cognitive bias that affects most people when they're exposed to compelling narratives about getting rich quickly. I reached across the table and touched her hand, feeling how much she'd aged in just the few weeks since her investments collapsed. The important thing is that you're learning to ask better questions now. You're developing the analytical tools you need to make informed decisions rather than emotional ones. But I feel so stupid, Mom. I was so arrogant about my expertise, so condescending about your supposed lack of understanding. And all the time, you were sitting there knowing that I was making terrible mistakes. The guilt in her voice was palpable, and I understood that we were dealing with more than just financial losses. Sarah was confronting the realization that her entire self-image as a sophisticated, successful professional had been built partly on illusion. She'd been so confident in her superior understanding of modern markets that she'd never stopped to question whether that understanding was actually accurate. You weren't stupid, sweetheart. You were inexperienced. There's a difference. I gathered up the research documents and returned them to their folder. Inexperience can be corrected through education and practice. Stupidity is a permanent condition, and you're definitely not afflicted with that. She managed a weak smile. I'm not sure David's going to see the distinction when I tell him what happened. That was the conversation we'd both been dreading. David still didn't know about the extent of Sarah's losses, or the fact that she'd liquidated their retirement savings for cryptocurrency speculation. She'd been putting off the disclosure for weeks, hoping to find a way to minimize the damage, before revealing the full scope of the situation. When are you planning to talk to him? Tonight. He knows something's wrong. I've been acting too strange for him not to notice, but I'm terrified, Mom. What if he can't forgive me? What if this destroys our marriage? I understood her fear, but I also knew that delaying the conversation would only make it worse. Trust, once damaged by deception, became exponentially harder to repair with each passing day of continued concealment. Sarah, David loves you. He's going to be angry and disappointed, but he'll also understand that you were trying to help your family's financial future, even if you went about it in the wrong way. What if he doesn't? What if he decides he can't trust me with financial decisions anymore? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that went far beyond immediate concerns about investment losses. Sarah was beginning to understand that actions had consequences that extended into every aspect of her relationships, that financial decisions weren't isolated events, but integral parts of the trust and communication that held marriages together. Then you'll work together to rebuild that trust. You'll develop new systems for making financial decisions together. You'll be more transparent about risks and more collaborative about strategies. I paused, then added gently, and you'll learn that true partnership means making major decisions together, rather than surprising each other with fait accompli. That evening, I stayed late at Sarah's house, ostensibly to help with dinner, but actually to provide moral support for the conversation she needed to have with David. The children were at friends' houses, giving their parents privacy for what would undoubtedly be a difficult discussion. David arrived home from work at his usual time, carrying his briefcase and wearing the slightly tired expression of someone who'd spent 8 hours solving other people's problems. He kissed Sarah, hello, and nodded politely to me, clearly wondering why I was there on a weeknight but too well-mannered to ask directly. David, we need to talk, Sarah said as soon as he'd set down his briefcase. There's something I need to tell you about our finances. The change in his expression was immediate and alarming. In 20 years of marriage, conversations that began with, "We need to talk about our finances," had never delivered good news. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling into his chair at the kitchen table with the careful movements of someone preparing for impact. Sarah looked at me for encouragement, then took a deep breath and began explaining what had happened over the past several months. She described her initial investments in cryptocurrency, her growing confidence as the markets rose, her decision to increase her positions, and finally, the catastrophic losses that had wiped out most of their savings. David listened in silence, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and gradually mounting anger. When Sarah finished her explanation, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. $84,000, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "You lost $84,000 in cryptocurrency speculation." "Yes. And you liquidated our retirement accounts without discussing it with me." "Yes. And you borrowed against my life insurance policy." "Yes." David stood up and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at their backyard where a swing set sat unused now that the children had outgrown it. When he turned back to face us, his expression was a mixture of hurt and bewilderment that was painful to witness. "Sarah, I don't understand how this happened. We've always made financial decisions together. We've always discussed major expenditures and investment strategies. How did you decide to risk our entire financial future without even mentioning it? To me?" The question was fair and devastating. Sarah had no defense except the truth. She'd been so confident in her understanding of cryptocurrency markets that she'd viewed David's potential objections as obstacles to overcome rather than wisdom to consider. "I thought I was protecting you from having to worry about complex investment decisions," she said weakly. "I thought I understood something you didn't, and I wanted to surprise you with the results." "Surprise me with the results," David repeated, the phrase with the kind of bitter irony that suggested their marriage had just sustained damage that would take years to repair. "Well, you certainly succeeded in surprising me." "David, I know how this sounds, but I was trying to help our family. I saw an opportunity to generate returns that would set us up for life, and I didn't want to miss it while we spent months debating the decision." "An opportunity." He shook his head slowly. "Sarah, what you're describing isn't an opportunity. It's gambling. You took our life savings to a casino and lost it all on a single bet." The comparison was harsh but accurate, and Sarah winced as if she'd been slapped. "It wasn't supposed to be gambling. I did research. I read articles and forums. I thought I understood the risks." "Whose research? What articles? What forums?" David's voice was rising now, his careful control beginning to slip. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you got investment advice from strangers on the internet and decided that was sufficient basis for risking everything we've worked for." I cleared my throat gently, drawing both of their attention. "David, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Sarah has learned some important lessons from this experience, and she's not going to make similar mistakes in the future." He turned to look at me with an expression of polite skepticism. "Millie, I appreciate your support for Sarah, but I'm not sure how you can be confident about her future financial decision-making when she just demonstrated such spectacularly poor judgment." The comment stung, partly because it was based on the same assumptions about my financial sophistication that had gotten Sarah into trouble in the first place. David was treating me like a well-meaning but naive mother who was making excuses for her daughter's irresponsible behavior. "David, there are things about my background and expertise that you might not be aware of," I said carefully, "things that qualify me to provide guidance on investment strategy and risk management." He looked confused by my response. "What do you mean?" Sarah intervened before I could answer. "David, it turns out that Mom has been giving me financial education over the past few weeks. Real education, based on decades of experience that we never knew she had." "What kind of experience?" This was the moment when my family would have to grapple with a complete revision of their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. David had known me for over 20 years, had always seen me as Robert's sweet wife who baked excellent pies and asked thoughtful questions about his work. The idea that I might have professional expertise that exceeded his own was going to be difficult for him to process. "David," I said slowly, "I spent the first 15 years of my career working as a software engineer and systems analyst in Silicon Valley. I've been investing in technology companies since the 1970s, and I've built a substantial portfolio over the past 4 decades." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to reconcile this information with his established perception of me. "I'm sorry, what?" "Mom has millions of dollars in technology investments," Sarah said quietly. "She's been managing a sophisticated portfolio for longer than we've been alive, and we never knew because we never asked the right questions." The silence that followed was even more profound than the one that had greeted Sarah's confession about her losses. David looked back and forth between us as if we were speaking a foreign language, his expressions cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. "Millions of dollars," he repeated slowly. "Several million," I confirmed. "Built through systematic investment in companies and technologies that I understood well enough to evaluate their long-term potential. And you never mentioned this because—" The question was reasonable, but the answer was complex. How could I explain that I'd been systematically underestimated by my own family for so long that revealing my true capabilities would have required completely restructuring our relationships? How could I tell him that it had been easier to let everyone believe I was financially naive than to constantly defend my investment decisions and prove my competence? Because it was easier to let everyone believe what they wanted to believe about my limitations than to constantly defend my expertise, I said finally. Because being underestimated can sometimes be a gift that allows you to observe and understand without being questioned or challenged. David sat back down in his chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of complete bewilderment. "I don't understand any of this. How can you have millions of dollars without us knowing? How can you have been a software engineer without ever mentioning it? How can everything we thought we knew about you be completely wrong?" "It's not that everything you thought was wrong," I said gently. "It's that you only saw the parts of me that seemed relevant to my role in your lives. You saw a grandmother who baked cookies and asked about your work. You didn't see someone who might have professional accomplishments or financial resources that exceeded your own." "But why reveal it now?" Sarah answered before I could. "Because I needed help, and Mom was the only person who could provide the kind of guidance I actually needed. Not just financial help, but education about how to think about investing in ways that would prevent me from making similar mistakes. And because," I added, "it was time to stop pretending to be someone I'm not. Time to stop accepting condescension from people who assumed I didn't understand concepts I'd been working with since before they were born." David looked at his wife, then at me, then back at his wife. "So where does this leave us?" "Financially? I mean, Mom is going to help us recover from the losses," Sarah said. "But more importantly, she's going to teach us both how to think about investing in ways that will actually build long-term wealth instead of chasing short-term speculation. And the education comes with some conditions," I added. "No more major financial decisions made in isolation. No more investment strategies based on social media hype or get-rich-quick schemes. No more assumptions about who does and doesn't understand modern finance." David nodded slowly, still processing the implications of everything he'd learned. "I feel like I need to apologize for something, but I'm not entirely sure what." "You don't need to apologize for anything," I said. "But you might need to adjust some assumptions about what kinds of people are capable of understanding complex topics. Age and gender don't automatically indicate incompetence, and quiet confidence is often more reliable than loud self-promotion." The conversation continued for another hour as we worked through the practical details of financial recovery and the emotional complexities of rebuilding trust. But I could see that both Sarah and David were beginning to understand that their crisis had revealed something larger than investment losses. It had exposed the fragility of assumptions that had never been properly examined. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The secret I'd carried for 30 years was finally being shared, but the revelation was creating its own complications. How do you rebuild relationships based on accurate understanding when those relationships had been built on comfortable fictions? How do you help people see you clearly when they'd grown accustomed to a carefully constructed version of yourself? The questions followed me home, where I sat in my office surrounded by evidence of the person I'd been hiding. Tomorrow would bring more conversations, more revelations, more adjustments to relationships that had been based on incomplete information. The mask was coming off, but I was discovering that the face beneath it was one that even I sometimes struggled to recognize after so many years of concealment. 3 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Mildred Cooper Foundation for Women in Technology, looking out at 43 young women who had no idea they were sitting in a building I had purchased, funded by an endowment I had created, attending a program I had designed based on lessons learned over 5 decades in the technology industry. The irony was not lost on me. For 30 years, I had allowed my own family to believe I was technologically illiterate, while simultaneously funding scholarships and mentorship programs for young women entering fields where I had been a pioneer. I had written checks for computer labs and coding boot camps while pretending not to understand how to use Netflix. I had endowed chairs in computer science departments while playing the role of the confused grandmother who needed help with email. But today was different. Today, for the first time since I had begun this foundation work 15 years ago, members of my family were present to witness the truth about how I had been spending my time and my money. Sarah sat in the back row, still visibly adjusting to the reality of who her mother actually was. Beside her, David took notes on his tablet, his expression shifting between admiration and bewilderment as he watched me address a room full of women who hung on my every word about venture capital, startup strategy, and the importance of understanding both business fundamentals and emerging technologies. Emma and Jake were there too, my grandchildren finally meeting the real Mildred Cooper rather than the simplified version I had presented for their comfort. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, had been asking increasingly sophisticated questions about my background since learning about it 6 weeks ago. Jake, 15 and fascinated by artificial intelligence, had spent hours in my office learning about the early days of computer programming and asking whether I thought machines could truly think. The presentation I was giving focused on identifying sustainable business models in emerging technology sectors, drawing from examples I had researched and invested in over the decades. As I explained the difference between companies that solved real problems and those that simply created technological complexity for its own sake, I could see several audience members nodding in recognition of concepts they had encountered in their own startup experiences. The fundamental question you need to ask about any technology investment, I said, advancing to a slide that showed the life cycle of various tech companies over the past 40 years, is not whether the technology is impressive, but whether it creates value that customers are willing to pay for over the long term. One of the audience members, a 25-year-old engineer named Rebecca, who was developing medical device software, raised her hand. Mrs. Cooper, how do you evaluate technologies that are so new that there isn't much historical data to analyze? The question was sophisticated and showed she understood the challenge of investing in truly innovative companies. That's where technical expertise becomes crucial, I replied. You need to understand not just the business model, but the underlying technology well enough to assess whether it can actually deliver what it promises. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a case study of early internet companies in the 1990s. During the dot-com boom, most investors were making decisions based on excitement and market momentum rather than technical feasibility. They were funding companies with business models that violated basic economic principles because they didn't understand the technology well enough to recognize the flaws. Sarah shifted in her seat, and I knew she was thinking about her own recent experience with cryptocurrency speculation. The parallel was obvious. She had made investment decisions based on enthusiasm and social proof rather than technical understanding and economic analysis. The key, I continued, is developing enough technical literacy to ask the right questions. You don't need to be able to write the code or design the hardware, but you need to understand the fundamentals well enough to distinguish between genuine innovation and clever marketing. Another audience member asked about my background in technology, and I found myself sharing stories I had never told my family. I described the early days of software development when programs were written on punch cards and debugging required, physically examining printouts that could fill entire rooms. I talked about the excitement of working on systems that felt impossibly advanced at the time but would be considered primitive by current standards. In 1975, I said, I was part of a team that developed one of the first real-time inventory management systems for retail chains. The computer that ran our software filled an entire room and had less processing power than the smartphone in your pocket. But at the time, it felt like we were building magic. I noticed Emma leaning forward, completely absorbed in hearing about her grandmother's work in an era she had never imagined. For her entire life, I had been someone who needed help with technology. Now she was learning that I had been creating the foundation of modern computing, while her mother was still learning to read. The most important lesson I learned, I continued, was that sustainable success comes from solving real problems rather than pursuing technological sophistication for its own sake. The companies that survived and thrived were those that made people's lives easier or more productive, not those that simply demonstrated impressive technical capabilities. After the presentation, during the networking reception, Sarah approached me with an expression of mixed pride and confusion that had become familiar over the past few months. Mom, I'm still processing all of this. The foundation, the mentorship, programs, the building we're standing in. You've been running a major nonprofit organization while we thought you spent your days reading romance novels and tending your garden. I smiled, remembering the elaborate systems I had developed to keep my various activities separate and hidden. I do read romance novels and tend my garden, but I also do other things that seemed irrelevant to my role in your lives. Irrelevant? David joined our conversation, carrying a glass of wine and shaking his head in amazement. Millie, you've helped launch dozens of successful companies through this foundation. You've provided scholarships for hundreds of women in technology fields. How could you possibly think this was irrelevant to your family? The question touched on something I had been struggling to articulate since beginning to reveal my hidden life. How do you explain that you kept secrets not from shame or deception, but from a desire to protect relationships that seemed to require you to be smaller than you actually were? Because, I said carefully, my family relationships were built on the assumption that I was someone who needed protection and guidance. Revealing that I was actually providing guidance and protection to others would have required rebuilding those relationships from scratch. Emma, who had been listening to our conversation while simultaneously scrolling through the Foundation's website on her phone, looked up with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Grandma, were you afraid we wouldn't love you if we knew who you really were? The directness of her question took my breath away. At 17, Emma possessed the kind of clarity that came from not yet learning to complicate simple truths with adult anxieties and assumptions. I was afraid, I admitted, that you would feel like I had been lying to you for your entire lives. I was afraid that revealing my capabilities would make you question everything else about our relationships. But Grandma, Jake interjected, you weren't lying. You were just not telling us about parts of your life that we never asked about. It's not like you ever said you didn't understand technology or couldn't handle finances. We just assumed those things without asking. His observation was astute and uncomfortable. My family had constructed their narrative of my limitations without any input from me. Then I had chosen to live within that narrative rather than challenge their assumptions. The deception, if it could be called that, had been mutual and unconscious. Rebecca, the young engineer who had asked about evaluating new technologies, approached our group with a question that surprised me. "Mrs. Cooper, I've been reading about your early work on operating systems architecture. There's a paper you co-authored in 1976 about hierarchical file management that's still cited in computer science textbooks. Did you know that your work is still being taught to new programmers?" I hadn't known, and the information filled me with a pride I hadn't felt in decades. For 30 years, I had measured my worth primarily through my roles as wife, mother, and grandmother. Learning that my professional work had contributed to lasting knowledge in my field felt like recovering a piece of myself I had thought was lost forever. "I had no idea," I said honestly. "I stopped following academic citations when I left active software development." "You should be proud," Rebecca continued. "My professor described your team's approach to memory management as visionary, and said it anticipated problems that wouldn't become obvious to the broader industry for another decade." Sarah was listening to this exchange with fascination and something that looked like dawning respect. "Mom, you're not just wealthy, you're actually famous in the technology industry." The word famous felt too strong, but I understood what she meant. I had contributed to foundational work that had influenced the development of modern computing. Then I had invested successfully in companies that built upon those foundations. I had been hiding not just wealth, but a legacy of professional achievement that extended far beyond financial returns. As the reception wound down and family members prepared to leave, Emma approached me with a request that caught me off guard. "Grandma, would you teach me about investing? Real investing, like what you've been doing, not the cryptocurrency stuff Mom tried." "Are you sure? It requires a lot of reading and analysis. It's not as exciting as the get-rich-quick strategies you hear about on social media." "That's exactly why I want to learn it," she replied. "I watched Mom almost destroy our family's finances by chasing excitement instead of understanding. I want to learn how to build wealth the way you did, through knowledge and patience instead of hope and greed." Her request represented something larger than financial education. Emma was asking me to share not just my investment strategies, but the analytical framework I had developed over decades of studying technological innovation and market dynamics. She was asking me to be her teacher rather than her student, to share expertise rather than accept guidance. "I would be honored to teach you," I said, meaning it completely. Jake had been quiet during most of the evening, but as we prepared to leave the foundation building, he asked a question that revealed he had been processing everything he had learned about my hidden life. "Grandma, do you think there are other old people who are secretly much smarter and more accomplished than their families think they are?" The question was innocent but profound, touching on assumptions about aging, competence, and the stories families tell themselves about their members. How many elderly parents and grandparents were being systematically underestimated by children who confused gray hair with diminished capacity? How many accomplished people were accepting condescension rather than constantly defending their continued relevance? "I think," I said carefully, "that people often become invisible as they age, not because their capabilities diminish, but because others stop seeing them clearly. And sometimes it's easier to be invisible than to constantly prove that you still matter." "But you do matter," Emma said firmly. "What you've accomplished matters. What you know matters. The foundation you built matters." "Yes," I agreed. "It all matters. And maybe it's time for me to stop hiding that." The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in thoughts about revelations and adjustments, about the difference between who people appear to be and who they actually are. Sarah sat beside me in the passenger seat, occasionally shaking her head in amazement at the scope of what she had learned about her mother's life. "Mom," she said as we pulled into my driveway. I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you recognition for what you've accomplished and respect for what you know. I spent so many years treating you like someone who needed my guidance when you were actually capable of teaching me things I never imagined. You don't owe me anything, sweetheart, but maybe we can build a different kind of relationship going forward, one based on mutual respect rather than protective assumptions. I would like that, she said. I would like that very much. As I walked into my house that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of hidden achievements and secret knowledge was finally being shared with people who mattered to me. The careful compartmentalization that had defined my life for 3 decades was beginning to break down, allowing different aspects of my identity to integrate in ways that felt both liberating and terrifying. I settled into my home office and opened my computer, planning to review some investment research before bed. But instead of financial documents, I found myself opening a new document and beginning to write about the experience of being invisible in plain sight, about the cost of being underestimated, and the complexity of choosing when to reveal your true capabilities. Perhaps it was time to write the story I had been living, to document what I had learned about hiding in full view and the price of allowing others to define your limitations. Perhaps other people needed to hear about the dangers of assumptions and the possibility of being more than others expect you to be. Outside my window, the neighborhood settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, while inside, I began to imagine a future where I no longer needed to choose between being loved and being seen clearly. For the first time in 30 years, those 2 possibilities no longer seemed mutually exclusive. The secret was finally out, but the story was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.